The morning of September 15th started like any other Tuesday for the Martinez family. 7-year-old Emma sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs as she ate her favorite cereal, Frosted Flakes with extra milk. Her golden retriever, Max, lay peacefully on his dog bed in the corner of the sunny kitchen, occasionally lifting his head when he heard the crunching sound of Emma eating. Emma's father, Daniel Martinez, was preparing for work, wearing his usual construction company polo shirt and work boots. He was a respected contractor in their community, known for his integrity and hard work. Her mother, Lisa, was packing Emma's lunch box for school, carefully placing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, apple slices, and chocolate chip cookies inside. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Emma had no idea that in just 3 hours, her entire world would shatter into 1,000 irreversible pieces. Around 9:30 a.m., as Emma was in her second-grade classroom learning about fractions, her father was working in the backyard. He'd taken the day off to build a new fence enclosure for Max, a project they'd been planning for weeks. Daniel loved spending time with Max. The dog wasn't just a pet. He was a family member, a companion who'd been with them since Emma was 4 years old. Every evening after work, Daniel would come home and immediately head to the backyard with Max, spending at least an hour playing fetch, practicing obedience commands, and training him with positive reinforcement methods he'd learned from online videos and dog training books. He treated Max with the same care and attention he gave to his daughter. He'd never raised his voice at the dog, never disciplined him harshly, and certainly could never hurt him. But Daniel didn't know that his neighbor had been watching him through a gap in the fence. Mrs. lived in the house directly behind theirs. She was a woman in her late 50s with a perpetually bitter expression and an even more bitter heart. For the past 3 years, she and Daniel had been engaged in an escalating property dispute over the fence line between their properties. The original fence, installed decades ago, was supposedly 3 inches onto Daniel's property, according to the county surveyor he'd hired. Daniel had politely requested that Mrs. either move the fence or split the cost of having it properly repositioned. Mrs. had responded with rage, threatening lawsuits, calling the city planning department, and leaving angry notes on their doorstep. The dispute had festered, creating tension that bubbled up into their daily interactions. Every conversation between them now dripped with resentment and hostility. On that fateful morning, Mrs. had been sitting in her backyard, nursing her anger as she sipped her coffee. She watched Daniel working on the new enclosure, and an idea, dark and calculated, formed in her mind. She couldn't win the property dispute through normal channels. Every government office and surveyor had confirmed Daniel was correct. But what if there was another way? What if she could turn public opinion against him? What if she could destroy his reputation so thoroughly that he'd want to leave the neighborhood entirely? That's when she saw it, or rather, when she misinterpreted what she saw. Daniel had been teaching Max a new hand signal as part of their ongoing training sessions. It was a specific gesture where Daniel would quickly raise his hand and make a precise sideways motion, a signal that meant sidestep or move laterally. Max, being a well-trained and intelligent dog, would immediately respond by moving 2 feet to the side. This signal was derived from standard obedience training methods used by professional dog trainers worldwide. But through the gap in the fence, Mrs. saw only Daniel's hand jerking toward Max's body. She didn't see the gentleness in Daniel's movements. She didn't see the treats he was rewarding Max with after each successful command. She didn't see the dog's happy demeanor, his wagging tail, his obvious joy at pleasing his beloved owner. What Mrs. saw or claimed to see was a man yanking and striking his dog. She watched for 20 minutes, cherry-picking moments, misinterpreting every action. When Max scratched at his ear with his hind leg, she saw signs of distress from abuse. When Max barked excitedly at a squirrel, she heard the desperate yelps of a tortured animal. Her mind, already twisted by 3 years of neighborhood resentment, rewrote the entire scene into a narrative of cruelty and abuse. By the time she went back inside her house, she had constructed an elaborate story in her mind, one she believed completely, even though it was entirely fabricated. Mrs. spent the next 3 days gathering evidence. She took photographs of Max whenever the dog was in the backyard, zooming in on every minor mark, every imperfection in his coat. Max had several small scars on his body, nothing unusual for an active dog. He had a 1-inch scar on his shoulder from rough housing with another dog at the dog park 6 months ago. He had a small mark on his hip from playing too enthusiastically near a fence. These minor marks, captured in grainy zoomed-in photographs, would later become evidence of repeated beatings in Mrs.'s narrative. She also reached out to other neighbors, people who barely knew the Martinez family or had no interactions with them at all. She carefully crafted a story, presenting it with tears and emotional manipulation. She described witnessing horrific abuse sessions that she'd actually never seen. She spoke of blood on the dog's fur that never existed. She claimed to have heard the dog crying in pain from inside her house, even though sound didn't travel that way between the properties. Each neighbor she spoke to became slightly less skeptical than the last, not because the story was true, but because Mrs. told it with such conviction and emotional performance. On September 18th, Mrs. made the call that would change everything. She contacted the local animal welfare office and filed an official complaint. She described Daniel Martinez as a dangerous man who was systematically abusing his dog. She provided the photographs, out of context and deliberately misleading as they were. She provided the names of witnesses, neighbors who had only heard her second-hand account. She spoke with such apparent sincerity, such apparent concern for the animal, that the intake officer immediately flagged the case as high priority. The Animal Welfare Office, obligated to investigate all complaints, assigned an inspector named Robert Torres to the case. Torres was a decent man with genuine concern for animals, but he also had a caseload of over 200 active investigations. He didn't have time to be thorough. He looked at Mrs. photographs, listened to her tearful account, and made a preliminary determination. The dog required immediate removal from the home pending a full investigation. That's when the police arrived at the Martinez home at 2:47 p.m. on September 19th, just as Emma was arriving home from school on the bus. Emma walked through the front door to find her mother standing in the living room with tears streaming down her face, flanked by two police officers. Her father, hands behind his back, was being read his rights. The words animal cruelty, felony charges, and arrest warrant echoed through the house like a nightmare Emma couldn't wake up from. Max was being led away by an animal control officer, whimpering in confusion as he was separated from his family. Emma screamed. Her mother screamed. But nothing changed. Nothing could change what was happening. As Daniel was placed in the police car, he caught Emma's eye through the window. His expression was one of complete shock and utter devastation. He hadn't done anything wrong. He knew he hadn't. But the system was moving forward regardless, powered by a lie so carefully constructed that it had fooled everyone. And Emma, just 7 years old, understood in that moment that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes people lied, and that sometimes truth alone wasn't enough to stop injustice. The trial was set for 2 weeks away. Everyone assumed Daniel was guilty. The courtroom of Judge Harold Richardson was filled to capacity on the first day of trial, September 26th. Media outlets had picked up the story. A contractor accused of brutally abusing his beloved dog. It was the kind of sensational story that sold newspapers and drove clicks on news websites. Photographers crowded the courthouse steps. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone entering the building. The case had become public spectacle, and the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Daniel Martinez was guilty. Daniel sat at the defense table in a pressed gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. He'd lost 15 pounds in the week since his arrest, unable to eat, unable to sleep, consumed by the nightmare of false accusations. Beside him sat his attorney, Michael Harrison, a competent public defender with a perpetually exhausted expression. Michael was good at his job, but he was drowning in casework. He'd received this assignment only 4 days before the trial began. He'd spent those 4 days reading police reports, reviewing veterinary records, and trying desperately to construct a defense strategy against what appeared to be an overwhelming mountain of evidence. Across the courtroom sat the prosecution team. District Attorney Caldwell, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s who'd built her career on winning high-profile cases, and her assistant, a younger prosecutor named David who specialized in animal cruelty cases. Caldwell was a master of courtroom theater. She understood that juries weren't primarily moved by legal arguments or technical evidence. They were moved by emotion, by narrative, by a compelling story that made sense to their everyday understanding of the world. She had spent the past week carefully crafting her presentation, not as a series of facts, but as a dramatic narrative of abuse and cruelty that would resonate in jurors' hearts before their minds could raise objections. The jury selection had been telling. Caldwell had strategically eliminated potential jurors who had criminal defense experience or who seemed skeptical of authority figures. She'd focused instead on jurors with pets, jurors who were emotionally connected to animals, jurors who could be easily swayed by appeals to sentiment. By the time the jury was seated, 12 people and 4 alternates, the composition was heavily weighted toward conviction. These were people predisposed to believe that a man accused of hurting animals must be guilty. Otherwise, why would the police have arrested him? When Mrs. took the witness stand on the first morning, she looked like a grieving grandmother. She wore a modest navy blue dress, minimal makeup, and an expression of profound sadness. She'd clearly prepared for this moment with care. She brought a tissue, which she dabbed at her eyes periodically throughout her testimony. Her voice trembled when she spoke about witnessing the terrible things happening in the Martinez backyard. "I was drinking my morning coffee," she began, her voice soft and pained, "when I heard the most horrible sound, a dog crying, really crying in pain. I looked through the fence and what I saw," she paused here, overcome with emotion. Several jurors leaned forward, their faces already showing sympathy. "What I saw was that man, Daniel Martinez, yanking Max by his collar so hard I thought his neck would break. The dog was yelping, trying to get away, and Mr. Martinez just kept pulling harder. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Every word was crafted to create a visual image in the jurors' minds." Caldwell didn't interrupt her. She let the testimony flow unimpeded, knowing that the emotional impact was far more powerful than any cross-examination. Mrs. continued, describing multiple alleged incidents. She spoke of seeing Daniel strike the dog with his hand. She described hearing screams of pain. She painted a picture of systematic, deliberate cruelty. A man who enjoyed hurting animals, who had no compassion, who was a danger to the community. Her performance was so convincing that even Daniel's own attorney seemed to believe parts of it. Then came the photographs. Caldwell stood and approached the evidence table with ceremonial solemnity. She held up the first photograph for the jury to see, a grainy, zoomed-in image of a scar on Max's shoulder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A," she said, her voice carrying the weight of grave accusation. The photograph was projected onto a large screen in the courtroom, and distorted. What was actually a minor mark from normal dog play now looked like a horrific wound. "Mrs. Caldwell asked, 'Can you describe what caused this injury?' "That's from one of the beatings," Mrs. responded with complete confidence. "I saw him hit Max repeatedly on the shoulder. I think he used a belt or a stick. The poor dog couldn't even move for days afterward." None of this was true, but Caldwell presented it as established fact, moving through 5 more photographs in the same manner. Each image was shown. Each one was tied to a fabricated story of abuse, and with each one, the jury's belief in Daniel's guilt. Several jurors were visibly angry, glaring at Daniel as if his mere presence in the courtroom was an offense. The prosecution then called a parade of witnesses, neighbors who had never actually seen anything but who to hearing about Mrs. allegations. The prosecution called the animal control officer, Robert Torres, who that when he'd inspected the home, he'd noted several marks on Max's body, consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Torres hadn't actually said this was conclusive proof of abuse. He'd noted that the marks could be consistent with abuse, which is a very different statement. But in the hands of the prosecution, his careful language became certainty. They called a veterinarian named Doctor, a man with impressive credentials but questionable judgment. Doctor had reviewed the photographs and the animal control officer's report. He hadn't actually examined Max himself. Based solely on these materials, he that in his professional opinion, the injuries on the dog were highly suggestive of intentional abuse. When Michael Harrison cross-examined him, asking whether the injuries could also result from normal play, Doctor reluctantly admitted they could. But by then, the jury had heard the damaging testimony. They had formed an impression, and impressions once formed are extraordinarily difficult to change. By day 3 of the trial, the prosecution had built an apparently overwhelming case. The courtroom observers, reporters, community members, casual observers, all seemed convinced of Daniel's guilt. The energy in the room was one of judgment already rendered, of a conviction merely waiting for official pronouncement. Michael Harrison's defense was hampered by several factors. He'd had insufficient time to prepare. He didn't have the budget for his own expert witnesses to rebut the prosecution's testimony. He couldn't adequately explain the training methods that Mrs. had misinterpreted because he hadn't known to prepare for that specific line of attack. When he attempted to cross-examine Mrs., her answers were carefully crafted, her demeanor sympathetic. When he suggested she might have misunderstood what she'd seen, she looked wounded, as if he was attacking a person telling the simple truth. Judge Harold Richardson, presiding over the trial, was a man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness but also for being influenced by public opinion. He'd read the news stories. He'd seen the photographs. He was aware that this case was being watched. When he looked at Daniel Martinez, he didn't see an innocent man presumed innocent under the law. He saw a man accused by multiple witnesses, supported by photographs, evaluated by officials. The burden of proof might theoretically rest on the prosecution, but in practice, the judge's demeanor suggested skepticism toward the defense and receptiveness to the prosecution's narrative. By the end of the first week of trial, Daniel's shoulders had slumped even lower. His case appeared lost. The prosecution had conducted an in-courtroom theater, turning misinterpretations into accusations, suggestions into certainties, and a neighbor's vendetta into what appeared to be overwhelming evidence of guilt. No one in that courtroom seemed to remember that justice required more than a good story. It required truth. And truth, it seemed, had no voice at all. Emma sat in the courthouse gallery on the morning of the second week of trial, between her mother Lisa and her grandmother. The little girl had been forced to attend school remotely over the past few days so she could be present at the trial. Her teacher had sent assignments home, but Emma hadn't opened them. She couldn't focus on fractions or spelling when her entire world was collapsing around her. She'd barely eaten since her father's arrest. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her mother had caught her crying silently in her bedroom at 2 in the morning multiple times. Lisa held Emma's hand tightly, her own nails digging into her palm from the stress and anxiety. Sat on Emma's other side, a woman in her early 70s who had raised 3 children and now felt utterly powerless to protect her granddaughter from this nightmare. Both women watched the proceedings with a sense of helpless desperation. They knew Daniel was innocent. They had lived with him, loved him, witnessed his gentleness with Max. But watching the prosecution's case unfold was like watching a carefully constructed lie transform into apparent truth, brick by brick, testimony by testimony. The previous day had been particularly devastating. Doctor had returned to the stand for additional testimony. Caldwell had guided him through a detailed analysis of the photographs, having him speculate about which injuries might have been caused by blunt force trauma, and which ones could indicate systematic abuse over an extended period. When Michael Harrison cross-examined him, had become defensive, insisting that while he couldn't be absolutely certain, without examining the dog himself, the evidence strongly suggested intentional abuse. The subtle language of scientific uncertainty had been transformed into the language of professional certainty in the jurors' minds. Emma had watched her father's face crumble with each devastating testimony. She saw the way he stared down at his hands, the way his jaw clenched, the way he seemed to be physically shrinking as the case progressed. During breaks, Lisa would usher Emma out to the courthouse hallway where they'd sit on wooden benches, and Emma would listen to her mother whisper prayers, desperate, pleading prayers to God to somehow save her father from this injustice. But Emma was beginning to understand something crucial. God might not save her father. The system wasn't saving him. No one was saving him. If anyone was going to save him, it would have to be her. The revelation came during the morning of day 9 of the trial. The prosecution had called its final witness, a behavioral psychologist named Dr. Summers, who had never met Max, had never examined him, but who, with complete confidence about the behavioral patterns consistent with abused animals and the psychological trauma evident in photographic documentation. She spoke about how abused dogs develop anxiety, fear responses, and learned helplessness. She painted a picture of Max as a traumatized, broken creature destroyed by Daniel's cruelty. It was the final testimony the prosecution needed to seal their case. Caldwell was preparing to move toward closing arguments. The defense was clearly in shambles, out of ammunition, preparing for what seemed like inevitable defeat. That's when Emma's mind clicked into place. She suddenly understood something that the adults in the courtroom had missed. They didn't know about the signals. They didn't know about the hand gestures, the training method, the specific movements that her father had taught her and Max as part of their bonding activities. Emma had participated in countless training sessions. She'd learned the signals right alongside Max. She knew them as intimately as her own name. And she understood with absolute certainty that what Mrs. had witnessed through the fence wasn't abuse. It was training. It was the specific sideways hand gesture that meant sidestep. It was the reward system where her father would give treats immediately after the signal was obeyed. It was love expressed through patience and consistency. The prosecution's entire case depended on misinterpreting these signals as violence. If anyone could explain what those signals actually were, if anyone could demonstrate them, the entire house of cards would collapse. Emma's heart began pounding. Her palms started sweating. She gripped her mother's hand even. "Mommy," she whispered urgently, pulling Lisa's arm so close that her mother had to lean down to hear her properly. "Mommy, I know what they got wrong. They don't understand the signals. Daddy taught me and Max the signals. I can show them. I can show the judge what the signals really mean." Lisa's eyes widened. For a moment she didn't respond. Emma was 7 years old. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't an expert. How could her daughter's testimony possibly compete against expert witnesses and professional prosecutors? And yet something in Emma's voice, the absolute certainty, the desperate intensity, made Lisa pause. "What signals, sweetheart?" Lisa asked, though her voice trembled. Emma quickly, urgently explained the hand gestures her father had taught her. She demonstrated with her small hand, moving it in the precise pattern they'd practiced. She explained how Max would respond to each signal, how the training worked, how it was all about reward and positive reinforcement. Lisa listened, and as Emma spoke, realization began dawning on her face. Emma was right. Emma understood something critical that could fundamentally change the trial. "Mommy, they're lying about what they saw," Emma said, her 7-year-old voice carrying more conviction than most adults could muster. "They're saying Daddy was hurting Max, but he was just training him. They just didn't understand what the training looks like. Can we tell the judge? Can I show them?" Lisa's hands began shaking. She looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. This child shouldn't have to carry the burden of saving her father. No 7-year-old should have this responsibility. But Emma was right, and in that moment, Lisa realized that her daughter possessed knowledge that could only come from someone who'd witnessed her father's love for Max firsthand, repeatedly, over months of training sessions. During the lunch recess, Lisa made a decision. She approached Michael Harrison at the defense table, Emma at her side. The attorney was reviewing his notes, clearly preparing for what he expected to be a crushing closing argument. He looked up with the expression of a drowning man grasping at straws. "My daughter," Lisa said firmly, "has information about the training methods, about signals my husband taught her and Max. She believes she can demonstrate what Mrs. actually witnessed." Michael Harrison's skepticism was immediate and visible, but as Emma began explaining the signals to him, something shifted in his expression. This was real. This was specific. This was the kind of detail that came from actual knowledge, not speculation. This was the piece that could unravel everything the prosecution had constructed. "The judge won't want to hear from a 7-year-old," he said carefully, but there was a note of desperate hope in his voice. "It's highly irregular, but at this point we have nothing to lose. Let me request an emergency hearing. If the judge agrees to listen, your daughter might just provide the evidence we desperately need." Emma felt her mother's hand tighten around hers. She understood, in some deep place within her young heart, that she was about to do something terrifying. She was about to step into the adult world of the courtroom. She was about to face prosecutors who would want to discredit her. She was about to risk everything, including the possibility of failure and further heartbreak. But her father was innocent, and sometimes that had to be enough. That afternoon, as court reconvened and the prosecution was preparing its final arguments, Michael Harrison stood and requested an emergency recess. He approached Judge Richardson's bench and whispered something that made the judge's eyebrows raise sharply. The judge consulted with Caldwell, who looked irritated but curious. Judge Richardson announced that court would adjourn for a private hearing in his chambers. Emma's hands were shaking as she stood up. Her mother squeezed her shoulder supportively, whispered a prayer, and Emma, 7 years old but somehow containing the courage of someone far older, walked toward the judge's chambers, knowing that everything depended on what she was about to do. Judge Harold Richardson's chambers were nothing like Emma had imagined. She'd expected something grand and intimidating, but instead, the room was surprisingly warm and personal. Mahogany lined the walls, filled with leather-bound law books and framed photographs of the judge with his family. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows that overlooked the courthouse garden. There was a comfortable leather chair behind a large desk, and several chairs positioned around a small seating area where lawyers often met with judges privately. If the setting hadn't been so serious, it might have been a place where Emma could feel safe. But given the circumstances, it felt like the most important room in the world. Judge Richardson sat behind his desk, his stern expression softened slightly by a hint of curiosity. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and a reputation for fairness, though fairness and sympathy were two different things. Beside Emma stood her father, Daniel, his arm protectively around her shoulders. His hands were trembling slightly. He'd been brought from the holding area where he waited during recesses, and his face showed the shock of seeing his daughter about to participate in the trial that threatened to destroy his life. Emma's mother, Lisa, stood nearby, her arm linked through her own mother's for support. Caldwell, the prosecutor, stood near the judge's desk, arms crossed skeptically. She'd argued vehemently against allowing a child's testimony, claiming it was highly irregular and potentially manipulative, using a child's emotions to sway the judge's perception. Michael Harrison, Emma's father's attorney, stood beside Emma with a hand on her other shoulder, protective and encouraging. "Young lady," Judge Richardson began, his voice formal but not unkind, "I understand you have something to share with this court. Before we proceed, I want you to understand that you're not in trouble. You're here because you may have information relevant to this case. Do you understand that?" Emma nodded slowly, her small chin trembling slightly. She was wearing her best dress, a pale blue one with white lace trim that her mother had chosen. Hopping it would help the judge take her seriously. But she felt impossibly small in this formal setting, surrounded by adults and the weight of her father's fate. "Your Honor," Michael Harrison began respectfully, "Emma has observed her father's training methods with Max on numerous occasions. She has direct knowledge of specific hand signals used in the training process. These signals may have been misinterpreted by the witness." Caldwell's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Your Honor, with respect, a 7-year-old child's interpretation of animal training is hardly credible evidence. This is clearly an attempt to—" "Ms. Caldwell," Judge Richardson interrupted quietly, "I'll hear what the child has to say. You'll have opportunity to cross-examine if necessary. Proceed, Mr. Harrison." Michael Harrison knelt down slightly so he was closer to Emma's eye level. "Emma, can you tell the judge about the hand signals your father taught you?" Emma took a deep breath. The room felt very quiet. She was acutely aware that everyone was looking at her, the judge, the prosecutor, her father, her mother. All these adults depending on her 7-year-old words to understand the truth. Daddy taught me and Max special hand signals, Emma began, her voice small but clear. They're like commands, kind of. When Daddy wants Max to do something, he makes a specific hand movement and then Max does it. It's part of training him to be good. Judge Richardson leaned forward, genuinely interested now. What kind of hand movements? Emma stood up, gaining confidence as she explained something she knew intimately. Well, there's the sidestep signal. Daddy raises his hand and moves it to the side like this. She demonstrated the motion, her small hand moving in the precise gesture her father had taught her. When he does that, Max moves to the side. It's like telling him where to go. And what does your father do after Max does what's commanded? The judge asked. He gives him treats, Emma said. He says good boy and gives him treats or pets him. Max loves it. He gets excited every time Daddy gets ready to do the training because he knows he's going to get rewards. Caldwell was about to interrupt, but Judge Richardson raised his hand. Let her finish, Ms. Caldwell. He turned back to Emma. How often do you see these training sessions? Every day almost, Emma said. Daddy comes home from work and takes Max out to the backyard. We do the signals, we play games. Daddy reads books about dog training. He watches videos on the computer. He wants Max to be happy and smart. The judge's expression was shifting. The skepticism was being replaced by something else. Thoughtfulness, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt about the narrative he'd been accepting all week. Emma, I'm going to ask you something important, and I want you to answer as honestly as you can. Does your father ever hurt Max? Does he ever hit him or yank him or do anything that makes Max scared or sad? Emma's eyes filled with tears. No, she said firmly. Never. Daddy loves Max so much. He's always gentle with him. Max loves Daddy. They're best friends. When Mrs. says she saw your father striking Max with a belt or stick, what do you think she might have actually seen? The judge asked carefully. Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone twice her age. I think she saw the training signals. Maybe she saw from far away and didn't understand. The sidestep signal when you move your hand fast, maybe it looks like you're hitting if you don't know what it really is. But it's not hitting. It's just showing Max what to do. Michael Harrison asked, Emma, would you be willing to demonstrate these signals for the judge? And if possible, would you be willing to demonstrate them with Max present so the judge can see how Max responds? Judge Richardson raised his hand, stopping the attorney. Before we go further, I need to address something. He looked directly at Caldwell. Ms. Caldwell, I'm inclined to pause this trial temporarily. What this young lady is describing is a potentially significant alternative explanation for the observations that form the basis of your case. I believe this warrants investigation by an animal behavior expert before we proceed with closing arguments." Caldwell's face flushed with anger and concern. "Your Honor, surely you're not suggesting that a child's speculation should derail this prosecution. The evidence is clear." "The evidence," Judge Richardson said coolly, "appears to require interpretation, and I believe that interpretation should be informed by expert analysis of these specific training methods before we proceed further." He turned back to Emma, his expression softening considerably. "Thank you, young lady. You've been very brave today. Your testimony may have been more important than you realize." As they prepared to leave the chambers, Daniel pulled Emma close and whispered in her ear, "You did so good, baby. You did so good." His voice cracked with emotion, a mixture of pride, fear, and desperate hope. Emma buried her face in her father's chest, finally allowing herself to cry. She'd done what she could. She'd spoken her truth. She'd faced the judge and prosecutors and the formal world of the courtroom. Now it was out of her hands, and she could only hope it would be enough. Judge Richardson watched the family leave his chambers, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. He'd been presiding over trials for 35 years. He prided himself on his fairness and his ability to separate emotion from legal reasoning. But as he sat at his desk and reviewed the case file before him, he realized that sometimes emotion and truth intertwined. Sometimes the most important evidence came not from expert witnesses or carefully constructed narratives, but from the simple, honest account of a child who'd witnessed her father's love firsthand. He picked up his phone and called his clerk. "Get me an animal behaviorist, a good one. Tell them I need them here by tomorrow morning. Tell them it's urgent. And cancel the closing arguments until further notice." The game had fundamentally changed, and it had taken a 7-year-old girl's courage to change it. The decision to bring Max into Judge Richardson's chambers was unprecedented and somewhat chaotic. Animal control had been called to retrieve the dog from the facility where he'd been kept in custody since Daniel's arrest. The ride from the animal holding center to the courthouse took 35 minutes. Emma waited in her mother's car in the parking garage, her small foot bouncing nervously against the floor. She'd changed into more comfortable clothes, jeans, and a soft pink sweater, because her mother said she needed to be able to move freely for the demonstration. Her father remained at the courthouse, preparing with Michael Harrison for what they all sensed might be the turning point in the case. When Max arrived, he was confused and agitated. Being separated from his family for nearly 2 weeks had taken a toll on him. His usually bright eyes were duller. His movements were slower. He'd lost weight in the holding facility where he'd been stressed and anxious. But when he saw Emma, everything changed. The dog's entire body seemed to come alive. He lunged toward the little girl, his tail wagging so violently that his entire rear end shook. Emma dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him, crying into his golden fur. "Max, we're going to show them the truth, okay, buddy," she whispered into his ear. "We're going to help Daddy." Max responded by licking her face repeatedly, his joy at being reunited with his beloved girl overwhelming everything else. It was a moment that no amount of prosecution testimony could have replicated. The pure, unadulterated love between a child and her dog, the kind of connection that couldn't be faked or manufactured. An animal control officer named David watched the reunion with visible emotion. He'd been one of the few people who'd questioned the case's validity from the beginning. Looking at Max with Emma, he saw absolutely no signs of an abused dog. He saw a healthy, happy animal displaying the kind of trust that only comes from consistent love and care. Inside the judge's chambers, everyone was assembled again. Judge Richardson had cleared his entire afternoon schedule. Caldwell had insisted on being present, still believing she could defend her case or at least minimize the damage. Michael Harrison stood beside Daniel, who was barely containing his emotions as he watched his daughter being led into the chambers with his beloved dog. "All right," Judge Richardson said, his tone formal but with a hint of something warmer underneath. "Emma, I understand you're going to show me these training signals. I want you to demonstrate them exactly as your father has taught you, and I want you to explain what you're doing so I understand what we're observing." Emma nodded, her hand gripping Max's collar. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was it. This was the moment where everything either came together or fell apart. "The first signal we do is the sidestep," Emma began, her voice steadier now. She positioned herself in front of Max about 6 feet away. She glanced back at her father for reassurance, and Daniel nodded encouragingly. Emma raised her right hand and executed the exact motion her father had taught her, a smooth, deliberate movement to the right, her hand moving from chest level outward and down. It was a precise gesture, performed with the kind of muscle memory that comes from repetition and practice. Max immediately responded. He stepped 2 feet to his right, his eyes locked on Emma, waiting for the reward. "Good boy," Emma exclaimed, rushing to Max and pulling a small dog treat from her pocket that Michael Harrison had provided. She fed the treat to Max and petted him enthusiastically. "That's the sidestep signal. When I do this, Max moves to the side. It's a trick Daddy taught us." Judge Richardson was leaning forward, his entire posture changed. He wasn't a man dismissing a child anymore. He was a man witnessing something important. "Do it again," he said. "Do it several more times so I can see the consistency." Emma performed the signal 5 more times. Each time, Max responded identically. Each time, Emma rewarded him with treats and praise. The pattern was unmistakable. This was a training method based on positive reinforcement, not abuse. A dog doesn't obey commands consistently if he's being abused and traumatized. An abused dog doesn't respond with enthusiasm and tail wagging. Now show me another signal, Judge Richardson instructed. Emma demonstrated what she called the sit pretty signal, a hand gesture where her father would raise both hands and motion upward. Max would respond by sitting up on his hind legs, his front paws reaching toward Emma. Again, the signal was performed perfectly, and Max responded with enthusiasm and accuracy. Caldwell watched this display with barely concealed frustration. She understood what was happening. The judge was seeing exactly what Emma's father had been trying to tell the court all along, that the abuse Mrs. had witnessed was actually a trained behavior, a signal for a specific command, completely misinterpreted through offense by someone with a predetermined conviction that Daniel was guilty. Emma, Judge Richardson said thoughtfully, I want you to do the sidestep signal one more time, but I want you to do it quickly. The way it might look if someone was watching through a fence, not paying close attention, and didn't understand what was happening. Emma hesitated, then nodded. She performed the signal more rapidly than before, with more dramatic hand movement. Viewed in isolation, without understanding its purpose, it could superficially resemble someone yanking or striking. But Max still responded perfectly, still displayed joy and enthusiasm, still showed absolutely no signs of fear or pain. Do you see? Emma said with the clarity of a child stating obvious truth. If Mrs. was watching from far away and didn't know about the signals, she might think Daddy was hurting Max. But he's not. He's just training him. Max loves it. Look at how happy he is. Max, as if on cue, pressed his body against Emma and licked her face. The dog's complete comfort with his owners, his evident joy, his perfect health and alertness, all of it contradicted the narrative the prosecution had constructed. Judge Richardson stood and walked over to examine Max more closely. He ran his hands over the dog's body, checking the scars Mrs. had pointed to as evidence of abuse. He looked into Max's eyes, watching for any sign of trauma or fear. He observed the dog's body language, completely relaxed, completely comfortable, showing no defensive behaviors whatsoever. He gently lifted Max's paws, examining them for signs of abuse. He looked at the dog's teeth, his ears, his fur quality. Everything he observed indicated a well-cared-for, healthy, loved animal. This dog is not abused, Judge Richardson said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. I've seen photographs of genuinely abused animals. I've reviewed cases involving real animal cruelty. This is not that. He turned to Daniel. Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I should have questioned this narrative more carefully from the beginning. Daniel couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down his face. Judge Richardson turned to Caldwell, and his expression was stern. "Ms. Caldwell, I'm beginning to believe that this case has been constructed on a foundation of misinterpretation and possible malice. I'm going to need that animal behaviorist tomorrow, and I'm also going to need to re-examine Mrs. testimony. I'm suspending this trial until we can get to the bottom of what actually happened here." Emma watched her father, and for the first time in 2 weeks she saw him truly smile. She squeezed Max's neck and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We told the truth." Caldwell gathered her files with sharp, angry movements. The case that had seemed so airtight, so carefully constructed, was unraveling in real time because of a 7-year-old girl and her dog. Judge Richardson looked at Emma and Max together and felt something shift in his understanding of justice itself. Sometimes truth wasn't complicated. Sometimes it was as simple as watching a child and her dog perform a learned behavior, observing the love between them, and recognizing manipulation when you witnessed it clearly. "Emma," he said gently, "you've been incredibly brave today. Max couldn't have asked for a better advocate." Emma smiled, buried her face in Max's fur, and allowed herself to breathe for what felt like the first time in 2 weeks. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the courthouse at 7:45 a.m. on the morning after Emma's demonstration. She was a woman in her early 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing khaki cargo pants and a professional blazer. Her credentials were impeccable: 30 years of experience in animal behavior, a PhD in comparative psychology from UC Davis, published research in peer-reviewed journals, and testimony in over 200 legal cases involving animals. She'd worked with law enforcement, animal welfare agencies, and defense attorneys. She understood animals in ways that most veterinarians never would, not just their physical health, but their psychological state, their trauma responses, their learned behaviors. Judge Richardson had personally called her late the previous evening. "Dr. Mitchell, I need your professional expertise on a case involving alleged animal abuse. A child has demonstrated training signals that may have been misinterpreted as abuse. I need you to examine the dog thoroughly and provide expert analysis. Can you be here by 8 tomorrow morning?" Sarah Mitchell had cleared her schedule. She'd reviewed the case file, the photographs, the veterinary records, and the preliminary animal control report. She'd watched a video recording of Emma's demonstration with Max, and she'd formed preliminary conclusions that contradicted nearly everything the prosecution had presented. Now, as she entered the courthouse, she carried with her specialized equipment, digital photography equipment for documenting Max's condition, measuring tools for analyzing scar dimensions, behavioral assessment forms, and detailed notes from her preparation. Judge Richardson had arranged for Max to be brought to a secure, quiet room adjacent to the courthouse where Dr. Mitchell could conduct a thorough examination. The first thing Dr. Mitchell did was observe Max's behavior in the room before she touched him. She stood silently for 5 minutes, watching the dog's body language, his movement patterns, his interactions with the handler who'd brought him. She noted every detail in her leather-bound notebook. Max showed none of the behavioral indicators associated with abuse. He moved freely and confidently. He made eye contact without flinching. He showed curiosity about his environment. His tail was relaxed, not tucked between his legs. When Dr. Mitchell made a sudden movement, Max didn't cower or display fear. He simply showed mild interest. When she spoke in a normal tone, he didn't startle excessively. His baseline anxiety level was normal, not elevated. "I'm seeing a well-socialized, confident dog with normal stress responses," she murmured into her digital recorder. "No preliminary signs of trauma or abuse." She then conducted a comprehensive physical examination. She began at Max's head, checking his ears, eyes, nose, and mouth. She moved down his body, palpating his muscles, checking his joints for signs of injury. She examined the scars that Mrs. had highlighted as evidence of abuse. The scar on Max's shoulder was approximately 1 inch long and 3/16 of an inch wide. Dr. Mitchell measured it precisely and photographed it from multiple angles with a ruler in frame. "This scar," she documented, "shows characteristics consistent with normal play injury. The edges are well healed. The coloration suggests it occurred several months ago. The depth and width are inconsistent with deliberate striking. This is consistent with normal canine play trauma, possibly from rough housing or running through brush or fence." She found 7 other minor marks on Max's body. Each one she examined, measured, photographed, and documented. By the time she finished, she had a comprehensive record showing that Max's scars and marks were entirely consistent with a healthy, active dog living a normal life, not a dog subjected to repeated beatings. Then came the behavioral assessment. Dr. Mitchell used the Canine Behavioral Assessment and Research Questionnaire, a standardized tool used by animal behaviorists nationwide. She assessed Max's responses to various stimuli: sudden movements, loud noises, strange people, handling of sensitive areas. She observed his play behaviors, his food responses, his reactions to isolation and reintroduction. The results were unambiguous. Max scored well within normal ranges for all behavioral indicators. He showed no signs of learned helplessness, no defensive aggression, no anxiety disorders. He was, by every professional measure, a psychologically healthy dog. Finally, Dr. Mitchell reviewed the photographs that Mrs. had provided. She examined each one with specialized software that could analyze image quality, lighting conditions, and potential manipulation. She noted that the photographs were deliberately zoomed in, cropped to remove context, and selected to show only specific marks in the most unflattering light possible. These photographs, Dr. Mitchell recorded, appear to have been deliberately selected and cropped to present a misleading narrative. They lack context regarding the dog's overall physical condition. They ignore the dog's behavioral presentation. They magnify minor marks in ways that distort their actual significance. By 2 p.m., Dr. Mitchell had completed her examination. She prepared a comprehensive report that would become the centerpiece of the defense's rebuttal. 73 pages of detailed analysis, photographs, measurements, behavioral assessments, and professional conclusions. She sat down with Judge Richardson, Michael Harrison, and Daniel to present her preliminary findings. "Mr. Martinez," she began, looking directly at Daniel, "I want to state clearly, this dog shows absolutely no signs of abuse. He is physically healthy, normal, and psychologically well-adjusted. The marks on his body are consistent with normal activity, not deliberate harm. The behavioral assessment shows a dog who has been trained with positive reinforcement methods and who trusts his owners completely. In my professional opinion, spanning 3 decades of experience, there is no evidence whatsoever to support allegations of animal cruelty." Caldwell was present during this presentation, and her face grew progressively darker. She began asking aggressive questions, trying to find weaknesses in Dr. Mitchell's methodology or conclusions. But Dr. Mitchell was unflappable. Every question was answered with reference to established scientific literature, peer-reviewed research, and professional standards. She was not an advocate for the defense. She was an expert presenting objective findings, and those findings demolished the prosecution's case. "Dr. Mitchell," Judge Richardson asked, "in your professional opinion, what would an abused dog look like? What behavioral and physical indicators would we expect to see?" Sarah Mitchell pulled out a folder containing photographs of genuinely abused dogs from cases she'd worked on. The contrast was immediately, starkly apparent. The abused dogs showed visible signs of malnutrition, injuries in various stages of healing, behavioral trauma indicators, defensive aggression, and psychological damage visible in their eyes and body language. Max looked absolutely nothing like these animals. "This dog," Dr. Mitchell said firmly, pointing to Max, "looks like a beloved family pet who receives excellent care, consistent training, and genuine affection. The training signals that were demonstrated yesterday are consistent with standard positive reinforcement methods. They are not signs of abuse. They are signs of a well-trained dog and a responsible owner." That afternoon, Dr. Mitchell took the stand in court. Caldwell attempted a rigorous cross-examination, but Sarah Mitchell was a seasoned expert witness. She answered every question with precision and professionalism. She cited research. She referenced established standards in her field. She remained calm and authoritative, completely unshaken by Caldwell's aggressive questioning tactics. When Michael Harrison showed the jury photographs of Max appearing healthy, happy, and relaxed, and compared them to Dr. Mitchell's professional documentation, the contrast with the prosecution's narrative became unmistakable. The jury members' faces were changing. Their skepticism was transforming into belief. The careful house of cards that Caldwell had constructed was collapsing piece by piece. By the time Dr. Mitchell stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Richardson's expression had hardened into certainty. The prosecution's case wasn't just weakened, it was destroyed. What remained was the question of how this injustice had happened, and who was responsible for perpetuating such a damaging lie. Daniel squeezed his attorney's hand and allowed himself to believe, for the first time in 2 weeks, that he might actually be acquitted. Emma watched from the gallery and felt the weight beginning to lift from her small shoulders. They were getting close to justice. They were close to the truth finally prevailing. Judge Richardson's expression was granite hard as he watched Caldwell consult with her team at the prosecution table. The evidence had fundamentally shifted. What had been a seemingly airtight case was now riddled with contradictions and implausibilities. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's expert testimony had demolished the physical basis for the accusations. Emma's demonstration had revealed the training signals that explained the misinterpretation. And now, with the momentum decisively turned, Judge Richardson made a decision that would uncover the final, crucial piece of the truth. "I want to recall Mrs. to the stand," Judge Richardson announced on the afternoon of Dr. Mitchell's testimony. "Ms., I have questions regarding the specificity of your observations and the basis for your accusations." Mrs. took the stand visibly uncomfortable. She'd been confident during her initial testimony, bolstered by the prosecution's careful preparation and the apparent acceptance of her story by the judge and jury. But now, with everything changed, her composure began to crack. She wore the same navy dress, but her hands trembled as she gripped the witness chair. Judge Richardson didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mrs., you witnessed Mr. Martinez striking Max with his hand, and possibly with implements such as belts or sticks. I want you to be very specific. How many times did you actually witness an incident where Mr. Martinez deliberately and intentionally harmed this dog?" Mrs. hesitated. The question was simple, but its implications were devastating. She'd spoken in general terms during her testimony: incidents, repeated abuse sessions, horrible things. But now she was being asked for specificity, for concrete examples with dates, times, and detailed descriptions. I saw him multiple times," she stammered, "many times over several months." Dates and times, Mrs. Judge Richardson pressed. Give me specific dates and times when you directly witnessed physical abuse. Mrs. mind raced. She couldn't provide specifics because there hadn't been any. She'd seen training sessions. She'd misinterpreted hand signals, but she'd never actually witnessed deliberate striking or beating. The lie was unraveling. Well, there was that time in July when, she trailed off, realizing she had no actual example to provide. You're saying you witnessed multiple incidents of abuse, but you can't provide a single specific date or time. Judge Richardson's voice was sharp with accusation. Isn't it true, Mrs., that you never actually witnessed any deliberate harm to this dog? Caldwell stood. Your Honor, I object. The witness has to her observations. Sit down, Ms. Caldwell, Judge Richardson said coldly. Mrs., you will answer my question. Did you ever directly witness Mr. Martinez deliberately and intentionally striking or beating Max? The courtroom was absolutely silent. Everyone understood that this was the moment where the truth would either emerge or where Mrs. would commit perjury by doubling down on her lies. Mrs. Shoulders slumped. She looked at her hands. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, No, I didn't directly see him. I thought I saw. Speak up, Judge Richardson demanded. Did you or did you not directly witness physical abuse? No, Mrs. admitted, her voice barely audible. I saw through the fence. I saw quick movements. I interpreted them as, but I didn't actually see him hitting the dog. The jury stirred. This was a bombshell. The primary witness had just admitted that she'd never actually witnessed the abuse she'd reported. Michael Harrison stood. Your Honor, I'd like to establish the basis for Mrs.'s complaint. Specifically, I want to explore the property dispute between Mrs. and my client. Caldwell objected strenuously, but Judge Richardson overruled her. Proceed, Mr. Harrison. The motivation for false accusations is highly relevant to this case. Michael Harrison approached Mrs. Isn't it true that you and Mr. Martinez have been engaged in a dispute over the property line between your homes? Mrs. face flushed. There was a fence issue. A fence issue that you lost, didn't you? Mr. Martinez hired a county surveyor who determined that the fence was indeed on his property. That surveyor was biased, Mrs. snapped, her voice bitter. And the county planning department also sided with Mr. Martinez. They're all friends with him, Mrs. accused. So multiple independent authorities determined that Mr. Martinez was correct about the property line, and you were incorrect. That must have been very frustrating. Mrs. didn't respond, but her angry expression spoke volumes. In fact, Mrs., wasn't this property dispute ongoing for approximately 3 years? He was a bully about it, Mrs. said, her voice growing hostile. always threatening legal action, always making me feel like I didn't have any right to. Yes or no, Mrs. 3 years of dispute. Yes, she admitted. Judge Richardson leaned forward. Mrs., I'm going to ask you directly, and I want you to understand the seriousness of your answer. Did you fabricate these accusations of animal abuse because of your property dispute with Mr. Martinez? Caldwell stood to object, but Mrs. began crying before the prosecutor could speak. I didn't think anyone would actually believe me, Mrs. said, her voice breaking. I wanted to scare him. I wanted him to want to move away or settle the fence dispute. I thought if I said he was hurting the dog, maybe the city would force him to move or, I don't know what I thought. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. You fabricated serious criminal charges against an innocent man based on a property dispute. Judge Richardson's voice was cold, his disappointment and contempt clearly audible. I didn't think it would go this far, Mrs. said, her voice small. I didn't think there would be a trial. I thought I don't know, I didn't think. Did you take photographs of the dog with the deliberate intention to misrepresent minor marks as evidence of abuse? Mrs. nodded miserably. Answer out loud for the record, Judge Richardson instructed. Yes, Mrs. whispered. I did. The scars were from normal stuff, from him playing or running around, but I zoomed in and cropped them to make them look worse. Michael Harrison pressed further. And did you fabricate accounts to other neighbors, exaggerating what you'd supposedly witnessed? Yes, Mrs. admitted. I told them stories that weren't accurate. Mrs., in doing this, you have accused an innocent man of serious crimes, traumatized a child, and subjected a loving family to 2 weeks of judicial nightmare. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Mrs. buried her face in her hands and began sobbing uncontrollably. Her confession, once started, spilled out completely. She admitted to every fabrication, every misrepresentation, every deliberate act of deception. She admitted that she'd never seen Daniel strike Max. She admitted that she'd misinterpreted training signals as violence. She admitted that the entire case was founded on her desire for revenge against a man who'd correctly asserted his property rights. Caldwell sat at the prosecution table, her face ashen. She'd built an entire case on testimony she now understood to be false. She'd presented photographs she now knew were deceptive. She'd called expert witnesses to validate accusations she now recognized as fabrications. Judge Richardson looked at the jury with an expression of vindication and sadness. Ladies, you've just witnessed the complete unraveling of a false accusation. You've seen how a property dispute was weaponized into a criminal charge. You've observed how one person's malice can nearly destroy an innocent man's life. He turned back to Mrs. Your perjury and filing of false reports will result in criminal charges against you. You will face consequences for what you've done here." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Everyone understood that they'd just witnessed justice being served, but at an extraordinary cost. A child had to testify. An innocent man had to endure 2 weeks of hell. The entire family had been traumatized, all because one woman couldn't accept that she was wrong about a property line. Daniel Martinez sat at the defense table with tears streaming down his face. His attorney squeezed his shoulder. In the gallery, Emma watched her father and allowed herself to hope that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. The truth had emerged, painful and damning and absolutely complete. Mrs. Vindictiveness, her deception, her malice, all of it was now exposed for the jury to see. The stage was set for the final act of justice. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Harold Richardson prepared to deliver his verdict. It was 4:47 p.m. on October 3rd, exactly 18 days after Daniel Martinez had been arrested. The gallery was packed with reporters, community members, and curious observers who had followed the dramatic unfolding of the case. The jury sat in their box, though Judge Richardson's announcement made clear that a jury verdict would not be necessary. Daniel stood at the defense table, his arm around Michael Harrison's shoulder for support. His face was pale, his hands trembling. 2 weeks of his life had been stolen by false accusations. 2 weeks of uncertainty, fear, and the very real possibility that his life would be destroyed by a lie. His family sat directly behind him, Lisa with her hand on his back, holding Emma tightly, and Max, who had been permitted into the courtroom for this final moment, resting his head on Emma's lap. Judge Richardson's expression was grave as he looked down at the defendant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of judicial authority and profound moral certainty. "Mr. Daniel Martinez, you have been accused of animal cruelty, felony neglect, and causing unnecessary suffering to an animal in your care. Throughout this trial, evidence has been presented that initially appeared compelling and damaging. However, as we have discovered through the course of these proceedings, particularly through the testimony of an extraordinarily courageous child and a comprehensive expert examination by a qualified animal behaviorist, the foundation of these accusations has been completely and definitively undermined." Judge Richardson paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. The evidence now clearly establishes that the accused's hand signals were training methods, not acts of violence. The dog's physical condition shows no signs of abuse. The dog's behavioral state demonstrates complete trust and affection toward the defendant. The photographs presented as evidence were deliberately cropped and selected to misrepresent the dog's actual condition. And most critically, the primary witness has admitted under oath that she never directly witnessed any abuse, that she misinterpreted what she observed, and that she fabricated her accusations based on a property dispute with the defendant. Caldwell sat rigidly at the prosecution table, staring straight ahead. She'd already begun considering the professional consequences she would face, the disciplinary review, the potential complaints filed against her office, the damage to her reputation. Her assistant, David, looked down at his notes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Therefore," Judge Richardson continued, "I hereby enter a directed verdict of not guilty on all charges. Mr. Martinez, you are hereby fully exonerated. Your record will be expunged. The false accusations will be stricken from all official documents. You are free to leave this courtroom with your reputation, your liberty, and your good name restored." The gallery erupted. Reporters began shouting questions. Daniel collapsed into Michael Harrison's arms, sobbing with relief and joy. Lisa rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her husband, both of them crying. Emma leaped up, her small frame trembling with emotion, and ran to her father. Max followed, his tail wagging furiously, pressing against his beloved owner. The reunion of the Martinez family at the defense table was a moment that transcended the courtroom's formal structure. This was a family that had been torn apart by malice and false accusation, reunited by truth. This was a child who had stepped into the adult world of justice and made the system work the way it was supposed to work. This was a man whose life had been saved by the combination of his daughter's courage and objective expert analysis. Judge Richardson watched the scene with visible emotion. He raised his gavel and brought it down firmly. "This court is adjourned. However, before we conclude, I want to address several matters of record." The courtroom quieted. Judge Richardson turned his attention to Caldwell. "Ms. Caldwell, your office will face a disciplinary review regarding your presentation of this case. You presented as fact what turned out to be deliberate misrepresentations and false accusations. Whether through negligence or through failure to adequately vet your evidence, your conduct fell below the standards expected of a prosecutor. The state bar will be." He then turned to Mrs., who was still seated in the witness area. "Mrs., you will face criminal charges for filing a false police report, perjury, and potentially other charges related to your deliberate fabrication of accusations. You have attempted to weaponize the judicial system for personal revenge. The consequences of your actions will be severe." Judge Richardson's expression softened slightly as he turned to Emma. "Young lady, I want to commend you for your extraordinary courage. You faced a courtroom full of adults, powerful institutions, and uncertainty. You spoke the truth despite your fear. You demonstrated a commitment to justice that many adults never develop. Your willingness to testify likely saved your father's life and prevented a grave miscarriage of justice. You should be extraordinarily proud of yourself." Emma, still gripping her father's hand, nodded solemnly. She understood in some deep way that she had participated in something significant. She had learned that truth mattered, that courage was possible even for a 7-year-old, and that sometimes doing the right thing meant facing down powerful forces. The Martinez family left the courthouse at 6:15 p.m., stepping directly into a wall of media attention. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Daniel kept his family close, shielding Emma and Lisa from the overwhelming attention. Max walked between them, his collar held gently by Daniel's hand, the living symbol of truth prevailing over deception. Over the following weeks, the story spread through their community like a corrective force. What had begun as a narrative of animal cruelty transformed into a narrative of false accusation and injustice. The community's perception of Daniel Martinez completely reversed. People who had crossed the street to avoid him weeks earlier now approached him with apologies and admiration for his family's strength. Emma's school held a small assembly where her courage was acknowledged, though she felt uncomfortable with the attention. Mrs. faced criminal charges and subsequently pleaded guilty to filing a false police report and perjury. She received 6 months of jail time and was ordered to pay substantial damages to Daniel Martinez. She moved away from the neighborhood within 3 months, unable to face the community she'd attempted to manipulate. Caldwell faced a disciplinary hearing by the state bar. While she wasn't permanently disbarred, her professional reputation was severely damaged. She was required to take additional ethics training and faced increased scrutiny on her future cases. Several other cases she'd prosecuted came under review, leading to the discovery of similar investigative failures. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's testimony became a template for how expert witnesses could systematically dismantle false narratives through objective, comprehensive analysis. Her case was cited in subsequent legal proceedings and in academic discussions about animal behavior testimony in court. Daniel Martinez received a formal apology from the city and a settlement from the police department and animal control office for the improper handling of the case. More importantly, his professional reputation was restored. He received multiple job offers from construction companies eager to work with a man whose integrity had been proven through fire. But the most significant outcome was the change in Emma's understanding of the world. She had learned that justice was possible but not automatic. That truth required active assertion. That courage, real, genuine, terrifying courage, could change the course of events. She had learned that adults didn't always believe children, but that if children had the evidence and the courage to present it, systems of justice could work. 1 year after the trial, the Martinez family stood in their backyard with Max. Emma threw a tennis ball, and Max raced after it with the joy of a beloved dog living in complete security. Daniel watched his daughter laugh, and he felt the weight of those 18 days lift entirely. His family had survived something that should have destroyed them. They had come through the other side together, stronger, more bonded, and more aware of both the fragility and the resilience of justice systems designed to protect the innocent. Emma occasionally thought about Mrs., wondering if the woman had ever understood the magnitude of what she'd done, the lives she'd nearly destroyed, the trauma she'd inflicted on an innocent family. But mostly, Emma lived in the present moment, grateful for her father's freedom, grateful for Max's continued presence in her life, and grateful that the truth, when asserted with courage and clarity, could prevail even against apparently overwhelming forces. The Martinez family's story became known as the girl who saved her father. But in their quiet moments, Daniel would tell Emma that she'd saved more than just him. She'd saved the possibility that justice could still work, that truth could still matter, and that sometimes the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth. Max would rest his head on Emma's lap, his warm brown eyes reflecting the love that had endured through 18 days of hell and emerged stronger on the other side. Justice had prevailed, love had persevered, and truth, in the end, had proven more powerful than malice.